when you have overexposure to a hormone, and it causes the cell to produce fewer receptors and making the cell less susceptible or less sensitive to that hormone. So that's going to have an effect on the physiological response. And the next slide tells you basically what these three things do. The first one is obvious. Higher hormone concentration is going to give you more physiological response. Higher number of hormone receptors is going to give you a stronger physiological response. Influences exerted by other hormones. We'll see that some hormones, you have more than one hormone involved in a physiological process. Some hormones work together to bring on a stronger effect, and that's called a synergistic effect. In other words, more than one hormone working together to produce a physiological effect. That's synergistic, they're working together. But in some cases, one hormone will inhibit another one, and that's an antagonistic effect. So that also obviously is going to have an effect on how the target cell responds. So we'll see some examples of these things and what happens when you have too much of a hormone. What's going to happen to, what are some of the symptoms of endocrine disorders, because there are a lot of disorders that are linked to the endocrine system, and that's, these disorders are the result of either too much hormone or not enough hormone. So we're going to be looking at that as well. Now, most hormones are controlled by feedback mechanisms. You're only going to produce a hormone when it's needed. You're not going to produce hormones or most hormones you're not going to be producing all the time. There are some hormones that are produced at at certain levels all the time, but they're needed all the time. Other hormones are only needed once in a while and are only produced once in a while. So it depends on the hormone. But most hormones are controlled by negative feedback. There's one I can think of that's controlled by positive feedback. Hormone secretion is regulated by the nervous system. Your nervous system can actually stimulate hormone production in some cases. For example, your sympathetic nervous system stimulates, and that's a fight or flight system, stimulates your adrenal medulla to produce adrenaline or epinephrine. That would be a nervous system control. Your nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to produce, or adrenal gland to produce adrenaline. Chemical changes can also have an effect, like low blood sugar stimulating the pancreas to produce insulin. High blood sugar stimulates your pancreas to produce insulin. If blood sugar is normal, that inhibits or stops insulin production. And then you also have hormones that stimulate or inhibit other hormones to be released. We'll see that especially in the pituitary gland in just a minute. So most hormone regulation is negative feedback. In other words, the endocrine gland releases a hormone. The hormone has some kind of effect on the target organ. You get a physiological effect. And that usually results in some kind of circulating thing in the blood, something circulating in the blood, such as, if you're looking at the pancreas producing insulin, and insulin stimulates your cells to take up glucose. That's the physiological effect. You're going to have lower glucose levels, and that's going to feed back negatively so that the endocrine gland stops producing insulin, right? You're bringing yourself into homeostasis. On the other hand, if your blood sugar is too low, the pancreas responds to that by producing glucagon, which has the effect on the target organ and the target organ is the liver. It's going to stimulate the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose, and that glucose comes back to normal. Once it's at normal levels, that negatively feeds back to the pancreas, so it stops producing glucagon. That's negative feedback, and that's what's shown here. In this picture we've talked about before, or maybe we have, I know in my other class we've talked about it, maybe we haven't here. Here you have normal blood glucose levels, which are going to be around 90 milligrams per deciliter of blood. When the balance tips up and you've got too much blood sugar because you've just eaten a meal, there's the pancreas, that's the endocrine gland. It also contains cells that sense blood sugar levels. So those cells are going to stimulate the release of insulin, which triggers your body cells to take in more glucose, stimulates the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen, and that once the blood sugar goes back down to normal, then that negatively feeds back to the pancreas. You stop producing insulin. If your blood sugar is too low, it goes below that level because you haven't eaten in a while. Your pancreas will monitor that. It'll release glucagon, which stimulates glycogen breakdown. Glucose is released. You bring it back to normal. That negatively feeds back to the pancreas so that it no longer produces glucagon. So you're trying to maintain that blood sugar within those normal boundaries by using negative feedback. Any questions about negative feedback? What that means? Okay, yes.
So you could have like a simple definition of negative feedback.
Well, negative feedback means that when levels get back to normal, then, or in some cases higher or lower than normal, but we'll see some examples, various examples of negative feedback. But basically, when something gets back to normal, your body is monitoring that, so you stop doing whatever it was you were doing. So you're negatively feeding back. You're not stimulating more insulin production, you're stopping the insulin production when you get back to normal. Does that make sense? So you're stopping insulin production when you're normal, and you're stopping glucagon production when you're normal. If you were to keep on producing it, you're going to create imbalances in blood sugar. So you want to stop doing whatever it was you were doing when everything's back to normal. And we'll see lots of examples of negative feedback. Positive feedback, this is where a hormone brings on stronger and stronger effects. Instead of trying to get back to homeostasis and then stopping, in the case of oxytocin, as we'll see, oxytocin brings on labor contractions, and it keeps on being produced at higher and higher levels so that you bring on stronger and stronger contractions, and then the baby's born and positive feedback cycle ends. So oxytocin would be a positive feedback. We're going to talk about oxytocin in a minute, and we'll come back to that. But this brings on stronger effects, but it only works in some cases, so like in oxytocin. So the first one we're going to look at, the first hormone producer we're going to look at, and actually two hormone producers, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The pituitary is a tiny pea-sized gland attached by a stalk to the hypothalamus region of the brain. And together these work to produce a variety of different hormones. Here is the picture from your book. The thalamus region is, and the hypothalamus are in the diencephalon of the brain. This is below the corpus callosum. Here is the hypothalamus. It's below the thalamus. It's a tiny little region, but we talked about it in terms of autonomic nervous system control. It's a big control center of the autonomic nervous system, but it's also involved in endocrine function. And it's attached to the pituitary. So there's the pituitary gland right there. This one, in the actual brain dissection, there's the hypothalamus. The pituitary can't be seen because when you dissect the brain and you remove the dura mater around the brain, it tears off the pituitary. So there's no pituitary in that thing, but you can see it there. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum. This is an actual pituitary from the brain. There's the infundibulum. And there's two lobes of the pituitary, an anterior lobe on the front side and a posterior lobe on the back side. And two sides of the pituitary have different functions, as we'll see, or work differently. So the anterior lobe on the front side, and sometimes they've got it facing one way, sometimes it's facing the other. Whenever you see the optic chiasma, this is where the optic nerve where you have crossing over of optic fibers from the eye. That optic chiasma where it looks like an X there at the base of the brain. The optic nerve joins the optic chiasma, and then you have some of the nerve fibers crossing over, forming the optic tract. That's the optic chiasma, and it's right in front of the pituitary. It's right anterior. So if you're not sure which side you're looking at, look for the optic chiasma if it's in the picture, and then until you're on the anterior side. So this is the anterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe. So the person would be facing this way because that's the anterior side. Anterior pituitary, it produces and releases its own hormones, but it is stimulated by the hypothalamus to do so. Hypothalamus produces hormones that regulate what the anterior pituitary produces. So there's a relationship. And the hypothalamus, though it's a nervous system structure, it produces hormones. So it's both nervous and endocrine. You have a lot of overlap in the nervous and endocrine system, and this is one place where you have it. Posterior pituitary does not make any hormones. Instead, the hypothalamus makes a couple of hormones. They go down to the posterior pituitary, and your cell phone should be put away, please. Posterior pituitary then releases those hormones. So the posterior pituitary only releases hormones made here. It doesn't produce anything, it just releases hormones. And we'll look at a couple of those hormones in a little bit. So we're going to start with the anterior pituitary, which is also called the anterior lobe of the pituitary. I just call it anterior pituitary, but the anterior lobe of the pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. That's the technical term. And it contains glandular epithelial cells that synthesize 7 different hormones. Some of them we'll focus on, some of them we'll save for later, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The hypothalamus above the pituitary secretes what are called releasing and inhibiting hormones that either stimulate the release of a particular hormone or it inhibits production of a hormone. So the regulation, there's a lot of regulation by the hypothalamus. And these two, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, are connected by what is called the hypophyseal portal system, and we'll look at that in a minute. This is where the hormones from the hypothalamus travel through this portal system. And then the posterior lobe, which is also called the neurohypophysis, again stores and releases 2 hormones, which are actually synthesized by the hypothalamus. So we're going to actually focus on the anterior lobe first, posterior lobe second. So here is the base of the hypothalamus, which is right here. And then here's the infundibulum, which is the little stalk that connects, that stalk right there that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And then you have here the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. You can see the person's facing this way, so this is the anterior lobe. And you can see that the hypothalamus and anterior lobe have this blood supply here. You have a capillary bed, which empties into a portal vein, which leads to a second capillary bed. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. That capillary bed that empties into a vein. Over here is the posterior pituitary. It doesn't have that circulatory pathway. Instead, it's got an artery leading to a capillary bed, and then a capillary bed emptying into a vein, which is normally how circulation works. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. The pituitary gland, which is about the size of a pea, it's not very big, even though it's a very important gland and produces a lot of hormones. It sits within a cup in the cranial floor called the sella turcica, which, if you're looking down on the floor of the cranium, here there's been a transverse section, and you're looking down at the cranial floor. The sella turcica, you may recall, is Latin for Turkish saddle, because it's got a front ridge and a back ridge, and then there's a depression. The pituitary sits in that depression, so it's protected in that little cup of bone. This is in the sphenoid bone right here. And in terms of the location, this would be the inside of your nose, and that's the nasal septum. And then here's the cribriform plate. That's where the olfactory nerve fibers go up to the brain, right? Behind that is the sphenoid, and there is the sella turcica. So it's kind of posterior, just posterior and above where your nasal cavities are. All right, so that gives you an idea of where this is located. Now, what we're going to do is look at the anterior lobe first, and the anterior pituitary produces these hormones, these 7 hormones, which are regulated by the hypothalamus. These are the hormones that regulate the release of these anterior pituitary hormones. Now, some of these we're going to go into detail about, some of them we're not. I'm not going to expect you to memorize every one of these, because some of them we're not going to even really talk much about other than just real general stuff. But notice that in some cases you have a releasing hormone that stimulates, like in this case, growth hormone, human growth hormone. So the growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates, and this is coming from the hypothalamus, this stimulates the release of human growth hormone. But you also have growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which inhibits or stops the production. Inhibits means to slow down or stop something. So that's going to inhibit human growth hormone production. So you're regulating it, both positively and negatively. But there are other cases where you only have a releasing hormone. So, if the hypothalamus is releasing that, then that hormone gets released. If it's not, that hormone does not get released. So you don't always have inhibitory hormones. And I'm going to talk about some of the functions of some of these hormones just generally, but I'm not going to get into too much detail because you'll talk about them in the reproductive system. We're going to focus on human growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone, and later we'll talk a bit about ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin. But we're not going to focus a lot on these others, and because some of them are reproductive, and we'll talk about them in the reproductive system. But I do have, I'm just going to kind of go over some general stuff about those hormones. So here you can see the hypothalamus up here has cells, what are called neurosecretory cells, that release hormone into the bloodstream. That blood carries those releasing or inhibitory hormones to the anterior lobe and either stimulate or inhibit the release of these various hormones. And I wanted to check something about prolactin. Yeah, so prolactin actually has releasing and inhibiting hormones. So prolactin, this hormone is from the anterior pituitary, stimulates milk production, and it's either stimulated or inhibited by, stimulated by releasing hormones or inhibited by inhibitory hormones, so that you're not making milk when you're not supposed to be. So there's prolactin that stimulates milk production. There's human growth hormone, which stimulates growth of muscle and bone and other tissues, but also has many other functions we'll talk about. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And these are the effectors. These are what the target cells, where the target cells are. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its own hormones. So here's a case where you've got a releasing hormone stimulating the anterior pituitary releasing a hormone that stimulates the thyroid, which then in turn stimulates or releases a hormone. So you have all these levels of control. Sometimes one endocrine gland stimulates another endocrine gland. In this case, you've got all these different levels of control there. And then ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce some hormones. FSH and LH, which stimulate the ovaries and testes. And I'll give you some information about these hormones. So there's a table that summarizes these various hormones and what they do and what they're affecting. This is the target tissue, but I've written it out for you. Some of the functions. We're going to focus on human growth hormone in a minute, so I'm not going to talk about that one. Thyroid stimulating hormone, we're going to focus on that one as well. That's the one that stimulates the thyroid gland to make its own hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, again, we'll talk more about it later, but it stimulates, in women, it stimulates the development of the oocytes, which are the eggs. In other words, the development of the eggs during the ovarian cycle. It also stimulates estrogen production, so it increases your estrogen production at certain stages of the ovarian cycle. In men, it stimulates sperm production. Luteinizing hormone, LH, and notice there's a lot of these have abbreviations because they're such long names, so there's often abbreviations, so you should know the abbreviations and what they mean. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation, which is the release of the egg. It also stimulates estrogen progesterone production as well. in men, it stimulates testosterone production. So, different effects there, but prolactin, I just mentioned before, stimulates milk production by mammary glands. It's either, it's controlled by releasing and inhibitory hormones from the hypothalamus. ACTH stimulates hormone secretion by the adrenal cortex. We'll come back to that when we get to the adrenal glands. And then there's melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. This stimulates melanin production by melanocytes. It also has effects on appetite suppression and sexual behavior. So those are some of the functions it's involved in. And we're not going to spend time probably any time at all on that one, but just kind of know the basic functions. So know the functions here, but we're going to focus on just a couple of these, but just know the basic functions for the rest of them for now. Some of them, like I said, we'll come back to. So as I mentioned, the anterior pituitary's hormones right here that we were just looking at are controlled by releasing and inhibitory hormones. And so how does that work? Well, and these are controlled, as it says here, by negative feedback mechanisms. Rather than reading off of this page, a bunch of stuff that doesn't really make sense when you're just reading it, you have to really see it in a picture to understand it. We're going to look at how the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary work together. So again, here is the base of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus contains what are called neurosecretory cells. That means a neuron that secretes a hormone. Neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. So there's the cell bodies of the neurons, these neurons that are hormone producing cells, and they're all clustered together in nuclei. If you recall, in the central nervous system, when you have clusters of neuron cell bodies, these are clusters of gray matter called nuclei. This is a highlighted, magnified image of the hypothalamus. All these little blue and green and red and purple structures are different nuclei. You don't have to know their names, but some of these nuclei contain those hormone-producing neurosecretory cells. So that's where those little clusters of neurosecretory cells are located, in some of these nuclei. And here's the pendulum. There's the pituitary gland right there. And we're looking at the anterior pituitary. Notice the optic chiasm on the anterior side in that picture. Okay, so back to this one. So those neurosecretory cells, these are neurons, so they have axons that travel down to close to where this capillary bed is. Now, we haven't gotten to the circulatory system yet, but capillaries are thin-walled, microscopically small blood vessels. It's in the capillaries where you have exchanges happening between tissue and blood. In other words, capillaries are what deliver nutrients and oxygen to your tissue cells. It's the capillaries that pick up waste products. It's the capillaries that pick up and deliver hormones. They're very tiny, they have very thin walls, so it's very easy to exchange stuff between tissue and blood. Usually, I think I have a thing here, normal circulation pathways are an artery leads to a capillary bed, and then the capillary bed empties into a vein. That's the normal circulatory pathway. And that's what you see here. This artery right here, don't worry about the name of it, but this artery leads to this capillary bed. We call it a capillary bed. It's a network of capillaries. And they're in the wall of that gland. And then those capillaries empty into a vein. And then so when hormones are released, they go into the capillary, and then the veins carry the blood away, and eventually that blood carries those hormones to other parts of the body. But look at the capillary system here. The hypothalamus it's releasing hormones to this capillary bed. That capillary bed is called the primary plexus. A plexus is a network. We've talked about plexuses before that were nerve networks. This is a capillary network. It's called the primary plexus because it's the first capillary bed. And that capillary bed is at the base of the hypothalamus. It's picking up either releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones that are either going to stimulate or inhibit hormone production down here. Those hormones are going to travel down what's called the hypophyseal portal vein, or veins. There's actually more than one. And you do need to know that name, hypophyseal portal vein. A portal vein, and there's more than one in the body, the portal veins are an unusual circulatory pathway in which a capillary bed empties into a portal vein, which then leads to a second capillary bed, and then that second capillary bed empties into a vein, a regular vein. So let's look at this one. The primary plexus picks up releasing or inhibitory hormones for the hypothalamus as appropriate, depending on the situation. The hormones are carried through the portal vein system, the hypophyseal portal vein, or veins, down to a second capillary bed, the secondary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system. So they call this a portal system because it all is connected together as a system. At this point, the releasing and inhibitory hormones are released from the capillary bed, and they're either going to stimulate or inhibit hormone production. If they're releasing hormones, they're going to stimulate hormone production. Those hormones get picked up by the blood in the capillaries and is carried away by the vein here. This hypophyseal vein carries that hormone away. And I think I have a picture that shows this a little bit better. So here are those neurosecretory cells in yellow, and they're producing, releasing, or inhibitory hormones. There's the synaptic end bulbs, but instead of releasing neurotransmitter, they're releasing hormones, releasing or inhibitory hormones. Those hormones, which are shown here in green, are released into the primary plexus, right there. The primary capillaries are the primary plexus. Those empty into the portal veins, or what they're calling portal venules, same thing. And those releasing, and if it's releasing hormones, it's going to, those releasing hormones leave the blood. Notice they're out in the purple area. The purple is the anterior pituitary tissue. The green releasing hormones diffuse out into the tissue. They stimulate these cells to produce a particular hormone shown in pink. The pink hormone, whatever it is, human growth hormone or prolactin or some other hormone, goes into the blood and is carried away. So the anterior pituitary hormones are carried away by the blood. So the greens are releasing hormones from up there. The pink are the anterior pituitary hormones. Now, if it's an inhibitory hormone, then you're not going to get hormone production if it's inhibitory, only if it's a releasing hormone. So this is, for all of those hormones, you're either producing releasing hormones or in some cases inhibitory hormones, but not always. And whichever is produced at that moment is going to determine whether or not you're producing a particular hormone at that moment. So the negative feedback is a little bit different. And by the way, these hormones, I forgot to mention, let me go back for a moment. All of the hormones coming from the anterior pituitary, let's see, let me go back, are, where did I have that? Are trophic hormones. What this means is not only do they have physiological effects, they all stimulate hypertrophy of the target organs, in other words, growth. They stimulate growth of the organ. Now, under normal conditions, this growth is going to happen as a child grows. You're going to get growth of these tissues, and then that's going to stabilize as in adulthood. You're not going to keep growing the tissue, but in adulthood, you're going to maintain, the normal level of hormone will maintain the size of that structure, whatever the target organ is. And these are the target organs. However, if you have low levels of these hormones, it can cause shrinkage or atrophy of those target organs. So this is one of the reasons why you want to have, normal levels, not only for the physiology, but you don't want to have too much. If you have too high a level of hormone, it can cause overgrowth of the tissue, as we'll see. Or if you have too little hormone, it can cause the target to shrink and atrophy. So when we say trophic hormones, what that means is they are hormones that have a physiological response, but one of those physiological responses is growth. They stimulate growth. So we'll see that when you have too much or too little of these hormones, what kind of effects they can have. So let's go back to where we were. So when they say trophic hormones, it just means those anterior pituitary hormones. And so, oftentimes, though not always, so here you have the hypothalamus stimulating releasing hormones, or releasing these releasing hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce trophic hormones. think it's not tropic hormones, but trophic hormones. And then, or I think it's sometimes spelled tropic. But anyway, the trophic hormones stimulate the endocrine glands to secrete their hormone. And oftentimes, it's the hormone itself that negatively feeds back. In other words, once you get to the normal level of hormone or higher than normal hormone levels, it feeds back to the pituitary and suppresses this production, feeds back to the hypothalamus as well, and inhibits releasing hormone production. We'll see this in some cases. Sometimes it's the physiological effect that negatively feeds back, but sometimes it's the hormone itself that negatively feeds back. The levels of hormone can sometimes be a negative feedback mechanism, and that helps maintain proper levels. So for example, if you look at CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, this stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce ACTH, or it's got a very long name, I don't want to say it, but anyway, corticotropin is the shorthand name for that, or ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, and once you get proper levels of cortisol in your body, or elevated levels of cortisol, that's going to negatively feed back here and stop production here, as well as stopping production of the releasing hormone. So you're inhibiting both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And here's another example of the hypothalamus producing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH, which are called gonadotropins. This stimulates the gonads to do various things, including producing steroid hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Androgens are male sex hormones like testosterone. And that negatively feeds back to the hypothalamus when you reach proper levels, and it negatively feeds back to the anterior pituitary. So you're not only inhibiting the anterior pituitary, you're inhibiting the hypothalamus. That's negative feedback right there, okay? So you're controlling the production. You don't just keep on producing the hormone, you stop it when it reaches the right level. And then when it drops back down again, or when, in this case it's a little different because it's cyclical, but if it's, when it's stimulated to do so, it'll produce more hormone. But negative feedback keeps you from producing too much estrogen or too much testosterone, or it's supposed to anyway. That's how it's supposed to work. Okay, so we're gonna look at human growth hormone. Human growth hormone, you've probably heard of. It's probably one of the most well-known hormones.
It's one Lance Armstrong's famous for, I think.
It's what's that?
The one that Lance Armstrong's famous for?
Is that what he was taking?
I think so.
Yeah, and to make bigger muscle mass. Unfortunately, when you do that, when you mess around with hormones, it can cause things like enlargement of the heart, which can be dangerous, things like that. So hormones, if you play around with them, they can cause some really adverse physiological effects that could lead to health issues down the road. And so, and because we produce these hormones, sometimes it's hard to test for them, which is how people sometimes get away with it. But anyway, there are two hormones that control human growth hormone production from the anterior pituitary, and these are from the hypothalamus. Growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibitory hormone, and we'll look at the negative feedback in a minute. Human growth hormone, the little h stands for human, because there are other growth hormones in other animals. Human growth hormone is released by pulsatile secretion. In other words, it's not released continuously when there's stimulation, it's released in like bursts, little bursts of it. And what you do, and you're releasing it throughout the day and night, it kind of, it's released as levels drop and as, other factors, but you're releasing it in bursts throughout the day and night, but mostly at night. Your human growth hormone production is higher at night than during the day, and that has some effects. Now, one of the things that human growth hormone does is it stimulates the release of insulin-like growth factor in the liver and some other tissues, like muscle and bone, but primarily the liver. And insulin-like growth hormone, while it sounds like insulin, it is not insulin. In fact, it has the opposite effect of insulin. Insulin-like growth factor is named that because it's similar to insulin in its molecular structure, but it has completely different effects. So it's not like insulin in function, but only in how it appears chemically. Now, and I'm just going to call insulin-like growth factor IGF for short. So IGF and HGH, human growth hormone, not only stimulates IGF production from the liver, these two hormones, because this is a hormone, it's called a growth factor, but it is a hormone, they both have a synergistic effect. And remember, that means that two hormones working together to create a bigger effect. So they're working together. You always hear about human growth hormone, but really it's human growth hormone and IGF working together to create the metabolic effects they have. And one of those effects would be protein synthesis and cell division, which is involved in growing bone and cartilage and muscle. So they have that synergistic effect together. Yes?
Do your muscle cells actually divide? Because in another class, he kind of said that your muscle cells, you never really get new ones, they just get bigger.
Right, and I should change that because that is true. It should be growth. Well, you're having cell division and growth. So in the case of muscle cells, you're right. You don't increase the number of muscle cells, but you're getting muscle cell growth.
Like you have the same number like you're born with throughout your whole life, they just get bigger.
Yeah, they just get bigger.
That's why sport injuries never really heal right.
Right, yeah. I mean, you have some limited regeneration ability, but it's limited, yeah.
Is that why muscle atrophy is a really bad situation and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, it can be, depending on what's causing it. I mean, sometimes you get atrophy, like if you break a bone and you've got a cast and you can't move the muscle, it's going to atrophy from lack of use. But if it's atrophy from some other thing, it could be a problem. But certainly, if you had some kind of injury where you lost some muscle tissue or tore it up severely, you don't have the ability to regenerate new muscle. You do have some. You have a few stem cells, but not a lot to replace it.
So is that why people who got, what is it called, like a myocardial infarction? Like
Yeah,
they have
the
like
heart muscle, right, it
yeah.
doesn't grow back. Yeah, myocardial infarction, a heart attack, if the muscle cell dies, or the muscle tissue dies, it doesn't grow back, yeah. So you can't really
Whenever you
regrow your heart muscle or regrow much new skeletal muscle. So, if it's cell division and growth, so just think of the muscle as growing, the cells are growing, they're not dividing, but do have cell division in the cartilage and bone and other tissues that are stimulated by human growth hormone. But that's a good point. I really didn't think about that when I wrote that. Now, this is occurring in children. Children, are really growing their muscle and bone and cartilage, for growing, getting bigger. And notice that, I mentioned earlier that your your human growth hormone, HGH production happens more at night than during the daytime hours, which is why growth spurts occur at night. Children tend to grow more at night than during the day. They're resting, they're off their legs and, not moving around. And you've got more human growth hormone production, so that's going to stimulate more long bone growth and all that. So that's why children seemingly grow overnight. They might seem like after a couple of nights they're grown an inch. They literally do grow overnight. They're growing at nighttime. So that's when growth spurts happen. Now in adults, we're not growing anymore. We're not producing as high a level of human growth hormone for growth, but we do use human growth hormone and IGF to maintain our muscle mass and to maintain our bones and cartilage. So it kind of is more of a maintenance, not a growth kind of thing in adults. Now there's other metabolic effects that you might be surprised about. One of them is that HGH release is stimulated when you have low blood sugar levels. So when your blood sugar level drops below a certain level, you're gonna increase your HGH production, and which then increases your IGF production. And these two hormones not only have those growth effects, they also stimulate fat breakdown in your adipose tissue to get more nutrient or more energy to your cells, and glycogen breakdown to bring up your blood glucose level. So they kind of act like glucagon in that way, and that brings your blood sugar levels back up. This is particularly important at night. You're producing more of those hormones at night, and so this is why you usually don't get hungry at night, even though you haven't eaten for several hours. You don't usually wake up hungry in the middle of the night because of this maintenance. This keeps you from having to eat at nighttime. And so we really
Yes, you
shouldn't
don't
eat at
have that
night
problem.
because it's a good way of gaining weight. And your HGH and IGF are kind of keeping your blood glucose levels constant during the night hours. So you don't have to worry about eating. So in this picture is showing the feedback mechanisms, negative feedback. You've got low blood glucose or lower than normal. That's hypoglycemia, when your blood sugar drops below normal. And that stimulates growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which in turn stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce HGH. HGH then stimulates IGF production from the liver. These two hormones then stimulate the liver to break down glycogen, releasing glucose, bringing your glucose levels back to normal. And once you're back to normal, or you go above normal, there's going to be negative feedback. You're going to stop producing this, which means you're going to stop releasing this. So that negatively feeds back. And so this would happen like at nighttime when you haven't eaten. Your blood glucose goes down, so you're going to do that every once in a while to keep your blood sugar normal. If your blood sugar is high, like after a meal, and you have hyperglycemia or high blood glucose, that's going to stimulate the production of GHIH, which is growth hormone inhibitory hormone from the hypothalamus. That inhibits human growth hormone production so that you're not producing bursts of HGH or IGF, which is going to decrease the rate of glycogen breakdown. You're not going to be stimulating glycogen breakdown. In other words, you're not going to be doing much of that. And so your blood glucose is going to eventually fall back to normal. And then once that happens, when if you fall down below normal, like hypoglycemia again, that is going to inhibit GHIH production, and that's going to stop this feedback loop, or that's going to stop this from happening. So you've got two things happening kind of simultaneously, two effects happening simultaneously. Depending on the situation, you can have hypoglycemia effects or hyperglycemia effects, but both work as negative feedback mechanisms. In this case, it's the glucose level that is feeding back, not the level of hormone. It's the glucose level that's regulating HGH production. Any questions about that? Okay, so human growth hormone disorders. One is pituitary gigantism. This is when somebody overproduces HGH. This sometimes happens when you have a pituitary gland tumor. There's specialized cells. I didn't really talk about them, but you've got different cell types that produce different hormones. And if one of those cell types, the one that produces human growth hormone, gets overgrown, or too many of them, and you have a little tumor in the pituitary gland, it can result in overproduction of human growth hormone. And so you get too much stimulation of the growth plates, the epiphyseal growth plates, which are where hyaline cartilage is located. Let's go back to this picture, and then we'll come back to that. The blue areas are where you have the epiphyseal growth plates, and that's where growth is happening. Remember, that is places where you have zones of cartilage, where cartilage cells divide, and then the cartilage gets replaced with bone, and this is happening on both ends of the bone, so the bone grows. Well, if you have too much HGH in childhood and adolescence, it can cause too much growth. These are 22-year-old twins. By this time, their growth plates are probably ossified or close to being ossified, so the growth stops once the epiphyseal plates ossify. But you can see they're identical twins, and yet this twin who had the pituitary gland tumor grew a lot taller than his twin brother. So this would be a case where you have identical twins, but they do look different because of a change in the pituitary gland after they were born, even though they're genetically identical. Any questions about that one? That's called pituitary gigantism. And I don't know a whole lot about it. I don't think it's life-threatening. I guess I don't know how they treat it, or if they, I'm sure they can treat it. But as far as being a tumor, it's not the kind of tumor I don't think that leads to cancer, but I may be wrong about that.
It increases your chance for an aortic aneurysm because that aortic artery stretches out so long. Like a lot of really tall people, like famous ones, have all died from them.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also Marfan syndrome that does that. So Marfan syndrome weakens the connective tissue, but they're oftentimes very tall. Yeah, and then you do have that risk of aortic aneurysm. Now there's also the opposite, pituitary dwarfism, where there's it's called hypopituitaryism is another name for that. It means you're producing low amounts of growth hormone, and that of course means less stimulation of the plates and less long bone length. Now the trunk and head are normal, but it's the legs, the long bones, that don't grow. So the trunk and head are going to look normal. It's not like they're everything's proportional. This can be treated in childhood with human growth hormone supplements. They can, give you human growth hormone to help in childhood to help grow the bones. Now, if the epiphyseal plate ossifies and becomes the epiphyseal line in adulthood, then if you have overproduction of human growth hormone as an adult instead of as a child, and again, this could be due to a tumor, or it could just be due to overproduction for some reason. But I think tumors are probably the more common reason, as I understand it. But anyway, I'm not an expert in human growth hormone disorders. But this is called acromegaly. Because the growth plates have closed or ossified, you don't get long bone growth. Instead, the other tissues continue to grow, muscle and cartilage and connective tissues grow, and also the bones grow, but they grow outward instead of long bone growth. You get more growth at the surface, and it results in, now here she is as a child and a young woman, but you can see that the increase in cartilage has increased the size of the nose. The face becomes, the jaw especially tends to grow a lot more what they call appositional growth. The hands, the other, you get more enlargement of the bones in the hands and other structures. This can also cause the heart to become enlarged and other internal tissues to become enlarged. So there's other problems. There are some health problems that arise, not just appearance issues, but internal problems because of overgrowth of organs. Enlargement of organs can cause problems, especially with the heart, enlargement of the heart. So that's called acromegaly. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's look at the posterior pituitary real quick. The posterior pituitary has a different setup. It has a regular circulatory system, an artery that leads to a capillary plexus that picks up hormones from the pituitary and then carries them away. And there are two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, OT and ADH. And these come from the hypothalamus. So here is a picture that shows it in more detail. Here are those cell bodies of the neurosecretory cells within nuclei of the hypothalamus. Two different nuclei producing two different hormones, because each cell, you've got different cells producing different hormones. And they have these axons that run down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary. And so the hormones are released at the axon terminals of the axons. This bundle of axons is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. It's a really long name. It just means hypothalamus and hypophyseal is pituitary gland. So it means it's connecting these two things. It's connecting the hypothalamus with the posterior pituitary. But that is a tract. Remember, a tract is a bundle of nerve fibers in the brain. So that's a tract. So that tract contains those axons. The axons release the hormone when needed. The hormone gets picked up, again, by that, let me see if I can picture the next one. Let me see, go back here. The hormone gets picked up by the bloodstream and carried away. So the posterior pituitary isn't producing its own hormones, it's simply releasing them as they're released, into the bloodstream. They leave that posterior pituitary. So posterior pituitary just is a receptacle, not really it's storing some hormone and it's releasing it, but it's not making its own. So, any questions about that? We're on. Okay. That's the posterior pituitary. So, oxytocin, this is the one that stimulates labor contractions. And we're going to look at that briefly in the next slide. It also stimulates milk letdown. This is the milk ejection reflex during nursing. When a baby nurses It stimulates stretch receptors in the breast. The breast sends signals to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus responds by releasing oxytocin, and oxytocin then stimulates the milk letdown. And this is not prolactin. There's two hormones. Prolactin stimulates milk production. Oxytocin stimulates milk letdown or ejection. So this is why, and especially at first, when a woman first breastfeeds, it takes a few minutes to get the milk let down. You know, like the baby starts nursing, not maybe minutes, but several seconds. The baby starts nursing and nothing's coming at first, but then the baby starts getting milk because it takes a while to get that signal to the brain and then the oxytocin down to the breast. And in those seconds, there's going to be a delay. However, as a woman becomes more adapted, as she adapts to the breastfeeding, that happens faster. And in some cases, just the sound of a baby crying initiates milk letdown, which happens if a woman's got full breast and then she hears a baby cry, suddenly she's releasing milk, which is why you want to wear pads in your bra when you're breastfeeding, just in case that happens. But anyway, that's controlled by oxytocin. Now, we're going to talk about the uterine thing in a second. There's also ADH, which we're going to talk about in a minute too, so I'll come back to ADH, but it's an antidiuretic hormone, meaning it reduces the amount of urine that you produce from your kidneys when you're dehydrated. So here's the oxytocin thing. I've talked about it before, but when a baby is close to being due and it's upside down in the uterus and it's pressing on the cervix, it's stretching stretch receptors in the cervix. Those stretch receptors send input to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, in response, produces oxytocin that travels through the bloodstream to the uterus, stimulating uterine contractions. And so at first the uterine contractions are weak, but those uterine contractions press the baby more against the cervix, which stretches more stretch receptors, which feeds back to the brain, telling the brain to produce even more oxytocin. So this is not negative feedback, it's positive. In other words, you're getting a response, which is contraction, so that stimulates even more oxytocin production, not less of it. And that causes the contractions to get even stronger. And so with every cycle of this, the contractions get stronger, they come more often until you're having uterine contractions, every minute. And then finally the baby is pushed out of the womb. Once the baby is out, there's not that stretching. And once that baby's out, then no more stretching means reduced oxytocin production. Now, that oxytocin will be produced in smaller amounts. It kind of gradually declines in levels. But after the baby's born, those uterine contractions keep going for a little bit to push the afterbirth out. You want to get that out of the body. So there is a little bit of that oxytocin still left after the baby's born, but it's going to go down. But a woman might notice if she breastfeeds, at first, when the uterus is still, right after you've had a baby, the uterus is still stretched out, and breastfeeding stimulates oxytocin production, which stimulates milk letdown, but that also stimulates the uterus to contract and shrink. And so a woman might feel cramps, almost like menstrual cramps when she's breastfeeding at first. It doesn't last more than a few days or weeks or whatever, but she might feel the sensation of menstrual cramps. That is actually a good thing because it helps shrink the uterus back to normal, much better than not breastfeeding does. Yeah.
So women who don't breastfeed, it doesn't hurt them it takes longer for the uterus to go down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't shrink as fast. Yeah, it's going to shrink back. It's just going to naturally shrink back, but the uterus shrinks faster back to almost to normal if you're breastfeeding. Yeah, it does help with that. So it does have some benefits that way. Any questions about oxytocin? And when they induce labor, they're injecting you with a pharmaceutical form of oxytocin. They call it Pitocin. It's basically oxytocin that they're injecting to stimulate contractions. All right. Antidiuretic hormone, let's look at that real quick. This is controlled by osmotic pressure in your blood. And if your blood is normal, at normal osmotic pressure, you have the proper blood volume and solute concentration. Osmotic pressure increases when you have a higher solute concentration, which happens when you're dehydrated. When you have less fluid in your blood, dehydrated, that makes your osmotic pressure go up. When you're well hydrated, your osmotic pressure goes down. And just to remind you what osmotic pressure is, remember that in osmosis, water moves toward the side of a membrane, or side, it could be a plasma membrane, or this could be a tissue fluid, and this could be blood, right? But it's moving through a membrane, and it's moving toward the side where there's more solute. Water is attracted to solute, it's moving toward the side with more solute. Osmotic pressure refers to the pressure it takes to stop osmosis, and if you had this separated by pure water. So if this were pure water over here, and you have this concentration, it's going to take a certain amount of pressure to stop osmosis. That's osmotic pressure. And solute concentration affects osmotic pressure. In other words, the more solute, the more pressure you have to apply to stop osmosis. So if you have two solutions of different concentrations of solute, and you have more solute on one side of the membrane, or more solute, let's say, in your bloodstream, and less solute on the other side of the membrane, or less solute in your tissue fluid, water's going to move in that direction, but this is going to have lower osmotic pressure. This is higher osmotic pressure, okay? So you have osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus that are monitoring the osmotic pressure of your blood. When you become dehydrated, you're going to concentrate your blood. That means your osmotic pressure goes up. If you're well hydrated, on the other hand, or you have too much water in your blood, your osmotic pressure goes down. So you want to be at just the right level of osmotic pressure. That's isotonic. But if you get dehydrated, your osmotic pressure goes up. If you drink too much water, and you get too much water in your blood, your osmotic pressure is going to go down below normal. And that's what ADH does. It tries to maintain osmotic pressure. So real quick, you've got a couple of minutes, so let me go through this real quick. Your hypothalamus has osmoreceptors that detect osmotic pressure. If you're dehydrated, you're going to have higher than normal osmotic pressure. You have higher solute concentration, right? Because you have less fluid. And your osmoreceptors are going to stimulate neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus to produce antidiuretic hormone. That hormone, there's the secretory cells releasing ADH. ADH has different effects. One is it stimulates your kidneys to absorb more water from the filtrate before you urinate the urine, and makes your urine more concentrated. So this is why when you're dehydrated, you have concentrated urine. It also stimulates your sweat glands to decrease sweat production to hold on to fluid, and it stimulates vasoconstriction of arterioles to increase blood pressure, because dehydration can cause not only a drop in blood volume, but a drop in blood pressure. Now, once you're hydrated, you have low osmotic pressure, your osmoreceptors detect that, they inhibit the hypothalamus neurosecretory cells from producing ADH. And that's the negative feedback. So you don't produce ADH, so you're not going to have those effects. So you can sweat more, you can vasodilate your arteries and lower your blood pressure instead of trying to raise it. And your kidneys are not going to reabsorb as much water, so you'll have more diluted urine. And so you're either concentrating your urine or putting out more urine, depending on whether or not you're producing ADH. ADH concentrates the urine. No ADH makes you urinate more. Your hypothalamus is also what makes you feel thirsty, which is also going to bring in water. So when you're dehydrated, you do this, but you also drink water, hopefully, and that will bring your osmotic pressure back up to normal. But if you go above normal, this is what's going to happen. If you go above the normal level of osmotic pressure. So you're trying to always maintain isotonic conditions, which then maintains proper blood volume and proper blood pressure. All right, so we'll stop there and pick it up with the next plan, the thyroid. That'll be on Thursday.